Welcome, everyone, to a new episode in our series on Shivat Tzion, on the return to Zion. And tonight we're going to look at the different visions of what a messianic age looked like. What is the redemption? And we're going to look specifically at books from this period, from the Shivat Tzion, from the return to Zion, with the understanding that, of course, these different visions, we're going to look at one which really presents, presents the age, what we consider now the messianic age. And of course, it doesn't need a Messiah, right? When I call it a messianic age, I'm translating it into our language because a Messiah is not always central to the idea of this redemptive age. So, for example, if God is leading it, or if you're looking at either whether you say, oh, there doesn't need to be a king, God is the king, in which case there's no particular Messiah. Or if you're looking at it in a very down-to-earth way, as in Ezra and Nehemiah, where we have a ruler for now, and they're switched to another ruler, but there's no special messianic ruler who himself brings in this age. But there is this idea of a redemption of the nation of Israel and an age, an eschatological. I don't like to call it eschatological because it's not necessarily the end of history, right? It's just this future age. So we already have in the prophetic books both types, where we have kind of a description of natural bounty as being what's promised, or a description of an apocalyptic battle, or a new type of nature. Okay, so if we look, for example, let's take a look. I'll share my screen. Okay, so for example, Amos is a classic. As I'm reading from, now Amos is a very early prophet in the prophetic books, right? Now I am reading from Amos Tet, from Amos 9, and there are absolutely biblical scholars who will place this particular chapter later, just so you know, in case you look in biblical scholarship. But Amos, as a prophet, he prophesies in the northern kingdom before the Assyrian exile, when everything seemed to be going well. And he says, I'm here considering Amos Tet, Amos 9, to be part of the original time when Amos is prophesying. So he says, Hinei yamim ba'im ne'um Adonai, v'nigash horesh b'kotzer, v'dorech anavim b'moshech hazara, v'yitifu harim asis v'chod v'ot titmogagna. A time is coming when the plower meets the reaper. In other words, you're still going to be plowing your field, and already you have grain to reap, right? And the Vidorech anavim b'moshech hazar, the treader of grapes with the one who holds the bag of seed. All of the agricultural seasons are going to be compressed. Why? Because the harvests are going to keep going, and the time of reaping and preparing are going to be short. So in other words, you're going to have these tremendously long harvests, and it's going to be just a time of tremendous plenty, right? And when the mountains shall drip wine and all the hills shall wave with grain. Yeah, the harim, hitifu harim asis v'chol gvaot titmogagna. Amos has beautiful, beautiful language where you can imagine where with the mountains are dripping with wine, and all of the hills are just beautifully kind of waving or kind of looking like titmogagna. They don't look steady. They're kind of melting. They have the amber waves of grain right over them. V'shavti et shvut ami Yisrael uvanu arim nishamot v'yashavu v'nat'u chramim v'shatu et yenam v'asu ganot v'achlu et prihem. And I will return my people of Israel who have gone out into exile or who've gone out into captivity, and they will build the destroyed cities and they will dwell in them. They will plant vineyards, they will drink wine, and they will create gardens and eat fruit. Unitatim al admatam v'lo yatshu od me'al admatam asher natati lehem amar Adonai Elohecha. I will plant them on their soil, right? And that's the end. This is a vision of, let's just call it, to be simple, a messianic age, where there is kind of, you could say, well, the seasons are different, but it's also clearly spoken poetically. There's going to be tremendous bounty, and the people will return. That is the promise here, okay? As opposed to the Yom Hashem, right? The day of God, which we see throughout. Amos also refers to it, this idea of an apocalyptic battle with all the nations, where Israel is also involved Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? We have Amos himself says, why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light, says Amos. This is, you think you're going to get off scot-free. You think it's going to be good for you. It will not. You guys are going to suffer. This is not something to hope for. Okay, so we have also this idea of the day of the Lord, all these going back to early prophecies. Let's look at how this plays out in Shivat Tzion. Now, in Shivat Tzion, this is going to be in the return to Zion, the way people expect things to turn out. This affects how what they see as the actual redemption, right? Is what we're seeing now, is this the redemption? Is it yet to come? And you can see that there's almost certainly this struggle going on. What are we expecting? You're struggling with the potential disappointment. If you're expecting some major battle and it doesn't happen, then that's going to be disappointing. But there are, and it's interesting to see the more naturalistic aspects. And by natural, I don't mean without God behind them. It doesn't mean anything in these books to have a redemption without God. Obviously, everything's from God. So I don't mean by natural, I don't mean that it's missing the divine aspect. I'm just talking about what does it look like. So here I'm reading from Isaiah Nun Dalet 54. We are all familiar with it. Roni akara lo yalada pitzchi rina batzali lo chala ki rabim b'nei shomema b'nei bula amar Adonai. So you should call out, oh, infertile one who has not had a child. You should shout aloud with joy because you didn't have Cain, because those children of your desolation will be greater than the children of someone who has a husband and had children within that. What does this mean? This means your returning exiles are going to be so many that you can now rejoice. Who is this Akara? Who is this Akara? It is Zion. It's Tzion. Okay? Tzion, her children went out, and it's saying, what is it? It's not talking about really an infertile one. The translation of Akara is an infertile one, but here it's using the word to mean someone without children. Not someone who can't have children, someone who does not have children. She does not have children because her children are outside of her, but they will now return. Okay, now remember, I'm looking at what we call second Isaiah as something from Shivat Tzion, from the return to Zion. And so the returning exiles will be more than children before they went out into exile. Before they went out into exile, you had a certain number of people living within you. Now you will have even more of your returning children. הרחיבי מקום אוהלך ויריעות משכנותייך יטו אל תחסוכי, הריחי מטרייך בתדותייך חזקי. You should enlarge your tent, right? You're going to extend the curtains of your tent, and you don't save on it. You're going to just keep on building. Lengthen the ropes and make strong the pegs that are holding them. In other words, you're extending your tent because so many will return to you. Ki yamin usmol tifrotzi v'zarech goyim yirash v'arim neshamot. Because you will spread to the right and left, which really means to the south and north, right? And your children will inherit from nations, and they will dwell in the abandoned, destroyed cities. Now, this is interesting. It's interesting that it calls it a tent. This may be referring to the fact that the walls aren't built yet. Like it's hard to exactly place this chapter when it was either said or written, but it could be referring to this idea you don't have walls, so it's calling it a tent, right? People will gather to it and simply extend the tent. Al tir'i kilot teboshi, al tikalmi kilot tachpiri, ki voshet alumer tishkachi, v'cherpat al menutayich lo tiskriod. The main themes here are do not fear and do not be ashamed. You will not be shamed because you will forget the shame of your youth, and the shame of your widowhood you will no longer remember. Again, it really reminds us of what we were talking about in our last class about how the destroyed walls themselves of Zion, of Jerusalem, were a source of shame for the people. And the idea is you are going to rebuild. Everyone's going to come back and they're going to rebuild. Right? And because who is the one who made you is going to be your husband, as it were. And the person who redeems you is the Holy One of Israel, the God of all the earth. In other words, you are going to return because your God is the God of all the earth. And so you will return, you will rebuild, you will not be ashamed anymore. And God will take you back with love everlasting. Okay? And that's the end of it, right? I'll just skip this. I'll skip 6 and read 7. I'll skip 5 and read Zion. Berega katon azavtich u'rachamim gdolim akapsech. Left you for like a short minute. You could say for a short minute, but it also could be a momentary dispute. I left you, and with great mercy, I will bring you back. B'shetzef ketzef histarti panai rega mimech, uv'chesed olam richamtich, amar go'alech Adonai. I just in a very like in a quick anger, for a moment I hid my face, and with everlasting kindness I will have mercy on you, says your Redeemer God. And this is a vision of redemption, where what is the redemption? The redemption is the return and the rebuilding. That is the redemption. Okay? There's nothing here that is not natural and cannot be seen as what actually happens during Shivat Tzion. Okay? Let's look at another classic example of this idea. And why am I talking about this? Because the question is, people come back to Zion, and it is what it is. It's a difficult path they've chosen. They're rebuilding a ruined land. Are they seeing this as the promise that God gave, or are they looking forward to another age? And we'll see that both are true. There are prophecies that say this is it. This rebuilding is the redemption that God promised. Be happy and realize that what this means is God loves you. God loves you. God wants you to return. God wants you to rebuild. This is going to wipe away the years of exile and the shame of the destruction, the shame and the trauma of the destruction. And then we'll see there are other visions of tremendous either apocalyptic battles or simply a future, right, that is very different from anything they could possibly be seeing around them in the return to Zion. So let's continue on to Zechariah 8. God spoke saying, Ko amar Adonai tzvaot, kineti l'tzion kin'a gdola, v'chema gdola kineti la. God says, I was very zealous for Zion, and with great passion I was zealous for her. So it's zealous or jealous, but kin'a can be either. Ko amar Adonai, shafti el Tzion, v'shachanti b'toch Yerushalayim, v'nikra Yerushalayim ir ha'emet, v'har Adonai tzvaot har hakodesh. So says God, I have returned to Zion. I am dwelling in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem will be called the city of truth. And the mountain of God, of the Lord of hosts, will be called the holy mountain. In other words, I'm back, God says. I left, I am back, I am living in Zion. And how do you know this? Kol amar Adonai tzvaot, od yeshvu zkenim uskenot berchovot Yerushalayim, v'ish mish'anto biyado merov yamim. So says the Lord God, yet will dwell old men and old women in the squares of Jerusalem, each person with his cane in his hand. He's so old. What is this telling us? The squares of the city will be filled with little boys and little girls playing in its squares. So says God, it seems impossible in the eyes of the remainder of this nation. Those who came back, I'm saying you're going to have old people and children in Jerusalem. And you're like, nah, that's impossible. It even seems impossible to me, says God, but it will be. It seems impossible to you, but will it be impossible to me? And the answer is no, right? In other words, you can read it either way. Even to me, God says it would be impossible, but it's not. I'm telling you it's going to happen. Or, in other words, I feel your feelings, my nation, but I'm telling you it's going to be. Or, gan be'enai pale, No, Moshe. Is it also wondrous to me? No, it's wondrous to you, but I'm telling you, this is going to happen. And I want to pause here. What does this mean that they're going to be old men and old women and children? First of all, the fact that this promise seems incredible to the people who have returned to Zion tells us something about how difficult it was to return to Zion and to live in this situation. Okay? We're talking in Zechariah 8, they're already either in the middle of rebuilding, they've already rebuilt the temple. The walls, however, have not been rebuilt. The walls of Jerusalem have not been rebuilt. And they are looking at a ruined city. They are a poor nation. And this promise that you're going to have old people and children, there's so much wrapped up in this promise. Let's just take it apart for a second. So first of all, obviously they're going to feel protected in the city. Realize that right now the walls have not been built. So there's an unwalled city. They'll feel protected in the city. But also, there are going to be people who survive to old age, despite what you see now as a very difficult period. It's really, really hard. You don't have enough food. You don't feel, one assumes that they need to feel particularly safe either. There will be people who reach an old age and fill Jerusalem. And you will be able to have little children. You will have a future. You will have the next generation, and many of them. And realize also, who are these old people and who are these children? The old people are with canes. The little children are playing. They are not growing food. They are not working. You will be able to support and happily support these extra populations that are not actually, let's say, contributing to the economy, but they are your elders and your children. And you will be able, your community will be able to support this and happily support it. You'll be able to have your little children play in the squares of Jerusalem. And this vision is wondrous. And God says, but it's not too wondrous for me. And God says, I'm going to rescue my people from the east and from the west. Where the sun sets, right? In the west. והבאתי אותם ושכנו בתוך ירושלים, והיו לי לעם, ואני אהיה להם לאלוהים באמת ובצדקה. And I will bring these people from afar, and they will all dwell in Jerusalem, and they will be my nation, and I will be their God in truth and in justice. But today, you really say, oh, you're always quoting these verses today because we see it, right? But it's a good reminder that for the people of Return to Zion, this was the promise. This was, wow, can you imagine a future like this? But realize that it's a promise of natural abundance. And yes.
Were there exiles in the West? I mean, weren't all the exiles to the East?
So yes, West would probably need to be Southwest. Because if we look here, let me open a map. Here we are. This is a modern map. Okay, so if you see this map here, this is a modern map. But if you look that where everyone this is, all around the Nile, this is where people are living, right? So it does make sense that actually West would be Egypt. It would be Southwest, right? But this is in fact where people would be living. So yeah, right, good point. Let's move back to here. This will do relatively quickly. כה אמר אדוני צבאות, תחזקנה ידיכם השומעים בימים האלה את הדברים האלה מפי הנביאים אשר ביום יוסד בית אדוני צבאות ההיכל להיבנות. So what this verse seems to indicate is that these words were actually spoken at the foundation of the rebuilding of the temple, right? So you should take courage. It should strengthen your efforts, those people who hear these words from the prophets on the day that the temple is founded. כי לפני הימים ההם שכר האדם לא נהיה, ושכר הבהמה איננה, וליוצא ולבא אין שלום מן הצר, ושלח את כל האדם איש ברעהו. Says, because before you rebuild the temple, if we remember the words of Haggai, build the temple and there will be bounty. So here we see this similar idea in Zechariah. Before you rebuilt the temple, you didn't have any profit from your work. You didn't earn anything from your labor. You also didn't earn anything from your animals' labor. And not only that, but all of you who would come and leave were beset essentially by enemies, by one assumes by thieves, by ruffians, because in Shalom and Hatzar, you were not safe from enemies. And I set each person against his fellow. One assumes that there was internal strife as well, which you can understand when things are rough, there's internal strife. But no, now it's no longer going to be that way. It's not going to be like the first days for this remnant. Kizera hashalom hagef kizera hashalom, because it will be prosperous sowing seeds. Hagefen titain pirya va'aretz titain et yivula v'shem shamayim yitnu talam v'inchalti et she'erita amazeh et kol ele. The vine will give its fruit, and the land will give its harvest, and the sky will give its dew, and I will bestow all of these things on the remnants of the people. What is the promise? The promise is that you're going to have a decent harvest. Your agriculture will do what it's supposed to do. There will be rain. There will be harvests. Because until now, it has not been that way. You have gone through many difficult years. והיה כאשר הייתם קללה בגויים בית יהודה ובית ישראל, כן הושיע אתכם והייתם ברכה. Al tira'u techazakna yidechem. And just as you were a curse among the nations, house of Yehudah and house of Israel, so I will save you, and you will be a blessing. And so, in other words, what does that mean to be a curse among the nations? That nations would say, oh, may you be like Israel as a curse. But from now on, it will be, may you be like Israel as a blessing. Do not fear, and may, this is take courage. It really means may your efforts be strengthened. Right? And it goes on that just as I brought destruction, now I will bring good to you. And of course, you have to emet Israel, you have to speak the truth to one another, you have to do justice. And these are the things that are on that what you have to do, right? You have to do justice among yourselves as part of this. So what do we see here in these promises from Yeshayahu, from Zechariah? We'll see something similar in Malachi to a certain extent. We see the idea that what is the promise? The promise is natural bounty. Natural bounty and rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city, and dwelling within it. In this way of setting forth, they could certainly say, hey, this is what God promised. This is the redemption. God has returned to his city. And now we are going to wipe out the destruction. Any comments or questions until this point? Cheryl, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, it seems that people weren't convinced by this, if this is what the prophets have to say. I mean, are we saying, that life is so hard that they can't see their return as the redemption? I mean,
well, I think life is so hard that the promised redemption is that life won't be so hard. Okay, so that's what's going on now. What don't they believe? They're like, wow, old people and children in the squares of Jerusalem? Now, part of this also is that Jerusalem is still in ruins, right? You see a ruined city. Well, it's a packed promise, right? It includes many different parts of it that are just incredible to even imagine, right? Excuse me for my, my Zionism. I can't help but relate it to things now where I remember I came in like 1990 and I studied international relations here. And that's when I found out that Israel was considered a third world country. I was like, what do you mean it's a third world country? Like, no, it's considered a third world country. That's the category of Israel. And now I listened to a podcast that is talking about the Western nations and the problem that Western nations have with, are they having enough children? And he's like, but we see that it doesn't have to be that way, that even though we're educated and we're a Western nation, that we don't have children. Because look at Israel. Israel's also an educated Western nation, and yet they have children. We just have to learn from them, from their culture. It's a cultural thing. And I'm like, oh, wow, we went from being a third world country to being an example to other Western countries. He wasn't a Zionist. He was just like, hey, let's look at other Western educated nations. And here's an example of someone that seems to be doing something right. But if you would ask a professor of international relations that this is the situation that Israel was going to be in, right? I don't know if they would believe it. I think they'd say, no, there are geographic realities and economic realities, and this is the way Israel is, and this is when it can achieve, and it's always going to be in this kind of situation. Whereas the people here in the return to Zion, it's more than that. They're not thinking of things academically. They're living in a really difficult time. And it's hard for them to imagine it not being this difficult because everything seems to be part of the difficulty. They're having bad harvests. They don't have money. There's no peace, right? They leave and they're attacked. If they can't just go out, it says you're going out, you're coming back in, and you're under attack, you're in danger. And that won't be the way it is in the future. And their capital city is in ruins. There are no sturdy walls. The walls of Jerusalem are cracked. They're in ruins. And you're telling them that they're going to have such bounty that their old people and children will be filling the squares of Jerusalem freely? That's hard for them to imagine. That is the promise, right? That is the promise. And next, we're going to see other promises, right? Other visions of what it means to be in a messianic age. And we're going to ask, is this what happens after you achieve that? In other words, what happens when you, let's say, when you build the walls of Jerusalem and yet everything seems to be the same? Maybe that's part of it. There's a theory that, and it's a convincing theory, that there was a big hope after 67. There was a big hope that this is the messianic age now among religious groups. And then when it didn't happen, that's when you got a lot more kind of a messianic fervor in the religious community, because look at what we've achieved, and yet it's just reality, right? It's just regular life, right? That we have this. So let's take a look.
Miriam?
Yes.
I was just thinking, I think you already just touched on it right now, but I was thinking about the difference between this and Yefezkel with the whole geography of Jerusalem and the area changing and the exiles coming back sort of en masse with the land being flattened.
Yes.
Thinking that it's quite a contrast there and
Right. See, Ezekiel is prophesying right after the destruction, right? Or right before the destruction, right after the destruction. And Yechezkel, I'll just remind you, Yechezkel has a tremendously supernatural vision of the future where everything changes. Land is flattened. You have a new river that makes the Dead Sea sweet. You know, not salty, makes it usable. All sorts of things happen. And that's a vision. Again, those visions, just like you have the natural vision in Amos, we have those visions before the return to Zion, and we also have these visions after the return to Zion, sometimes in the same works, again, as we were reading this kind of promise of natural bounty. And those are kind of promising a complete change to nature, right? Sometimes nice and sometimes very militaristic, right? Sometimes it's with the day of the Lord where it's a huge battle. And sometimes it's just, well, the lion's going to lie down with the lamb. I think it's actually a wolf that lies down with the lamb. But, you know, the nature is going to be changed, right? Nature is going to be changed we're going to look at that in a bit. But the idea that, no, this isn't it. The natural world is not it. Okay, there's bounty, there's this, there's that. Now, and the question is, why do we need both, right? What's the purpose of both? And you could say, because the natural bounty doesn't seem to be enough, or because it seems so inaccessible that everything has to change in order for it to happen, right? So either way, there are also these prophecies of these tremendous changes. Now, once we get to what we call Second Temple literature, which is like a specialty of mine, books of the Apocrypha, the pseudepigrapha, books that didn't get into the Hebrew Bible. In those books, it's very popular to have these apocalyptic visions. But in that point, you already have Jerusalem is existing very much as a city, as a built-up city with a built-up temple, a very prominent temple. There is a lot of corruption going on. The high priest is something you can either purchase or get through royal appointment. It's not what the really religious people want. And they also see wicked people prospering. And to fix that, you need some kind of apocalyptic shakeup. And that becomes a prominent theme once you get to Second Temple works. But we already see it in prophecies in the Hebrew Bible. So actually, let's take a look because it's getting late. So let's take a look actually at Haggai. If we look at Haggai Bet Zion, so it's Haggai 2:7, right? We looked at this before. We're actually at Kol Goyim, and I will shake up all the nations, and that certainly sounds. And here we have a more of a supernatural thing, right? He says, "Odachat ma'ati," in just a little while longer. "Vani mar'ish et hashamayim v'et haaretz v'et hayam v'et ha'harava." I'm going to shake up heaven and earth, the sea and the dry land. I'm going to shake the nations, and all of their good things will come, and I'll fill up this house, the temple, with glory, with the Beit HaMikdash with glory. Liha kesef, liha zahav, Num Hashem tzvaot. Mine is the silver, and mine is the gold, says God. Gadol yekvod habayit hazeh hacharon min harishon, u'bamakom hazeh etet shalom Num Hashem tzvaot. The glory of this house, of this latter house, will be greater than the first, says God, and in this place I will give peace or prosperity. Now, in this case, we really know the context because Haggai is dealing with the fact that people are disappointed. In this case, where he starts with saying, "Be strong, Zerubbabel, and be strong, Yoshua, son of Yotadak," we know what's going on. This gives a good example of where we see kind of a supernatural tinge to things, and we know why. What's happening here? What's happening here is, because we have the context in Haggai, this is when they are rebuilding the temple. If you remember the dedication, and people are upset. People are upset because they remember the first house, and this is not it. This does not promise to be like the first temple. They see, is this it? Is this what we get? Right? And the answer is, don't worry. I will create something. I will shake everything up. And because mine is the silver and mine is the gold, this house will be glorious. It looks like nothing to you now, but I'm telling you, it will be more glorious than the first house. And the reference is to the physical reality of the temple. It's very clear that what it means is, I will shake up the earth, and all the nations will send gold and silver to the temple so that it will be glorious. And so don't worry that you're disappointed now. I'm going to shake everything up. Here, it's very clear that this kind of supernatural tinge to the promise is coming, first of all, because people don't think it's possible. They're disappointed. First of all, because they're disappointed. They're disappointed with what they see. And second, because they don't see how it's going to be better than this. It's not that they're disappointed and they're like, "Oh, we'll do X, Y, and Z, and that will make this house glorious." They're like, "We're disappointed and we have no money. This is what there is." And God's like, "No, I'm going to shake everything up." And as we mentioned last time we read these verses, in history, it kind of happened, right? Because Herod rebuilt the city, rebuilt the temple into way more than what it was in the first, way more than what the first temple was. But it's certainly, and you could even say, hey, that's what it means to everything comes from the different nations, like, because it's part of the empire, it's part of Herod's wealth and what he could do in terms of building the temple. But certainly for the people to return to Zion, that is far, far off, right? And they need this promise that everything is going to be shaken up. And because otherwise they won't see how this could happen. And so we see how this supernatural kind of vision is responding to both disappointment and a kind of a look at reality and saying, "Oh, but wait, how can this be better?" And the answer is, well, everything's got to be shaken up. Let's take a quick look at Malachi. So Malachi is speaking later than Zechariah and then Haggai. Zechariah and Haggai are speaking at the beginning of the founding of the temple. Malachi is speaking later when you have a functioning temple. His problem is you are bringing crappy sacrifices and you are not tithing correctly. You are not bringing what you need to do to the temple. And here again, we have this promise of bounty if you just do what you're supposed to do. In this case, regarding the temple, right? He says, "Aviu et kol hamaaser el beit haotzar v'iterach bebeiti ubachanuni na bazot amar Hashem tzvaot im lo aftach lachem et arubot hashemayim v'arikoti lachem bracha ad bli dai. If you just bring the full tithe into the store, the Beit HaOtzar, the storehouse in the temple, then there's going to be food in my house. And then test me, because you don't believe me. So test me, bring the stuff, and then you'll see that I'll open the windows of heaven to you. I'm going to open up the floodgates in the sky. Rain is going to come down, and I'm going to empty blessing with a limitless blessing onto you. וגערתי לכם באוכל ולא ישחית לכם את פרי האדמה ולא תשחל לכם הגפן בשדה. I'm no longer going to take away your food. I'm not going to destroy the fruit of the earth, and you are not going to lose the grapes or the vines in the field. Why? Because you've done the right thing. וישרו אתכם כל הגויים כי תהיו אתם ארץ חפץ. All of the nations will consider you, will say, oh, wow, how happy you are, because you are going to be like a lovely land, a desired land. Here we see a reaction to, again, the difficulty of life, and therefore the promise is simply bounty. Then, even though this is much later than Haggai and Zechariah, this is when there's already a functioning temple, a functioning Beit HaMikdash, we still see that what's going on is they don't have enough food, they don't have enough rain, and so they're not bringing what they need to the temple. And the answer is just do this and you'll have bounty. That is the promise. And I think that we can see here the same way that when we looked at Haggai, it kind of showed us where kind of the supernatural promise was coming from. The combination of disappointment and disbelief that it could get better. Here, the natural promise we can see is very much connected to the fact that they don't have. They have nothing. So what they want, that just a promise, just the natural promise, is what they're yearning for. Whereas what we saw in Zechariah was the natural promise combined with something that, even though to us it seems natural, to them it was almost unbelievable, this idea that you'd have a safe city with elderly and children in it, right? So even though that's natural, this was truly looking ahead to the future. Whereas here we're looking much more in terms of just their survival and the immediate bounty that they're yearning for. So what we saw in this class was we were looking at the promises, the natural promises that we're seeing in the return to Zion, and how they dealt with partially the disappointment, but also the difficult nature of life during the return to Zion. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have peace, they didn't feel safe, and these promises were about bounty and peace, beautiful promises that yet, in like, for example, in Zechariah seemed almost impossible because of the distress of the community. At the same time, it's the disappointment also coupled with a disbelief that things could get better that possibly fuel some of these supernatural prophecies. And that's what we're going to be looking at more in our next class. Well, thank you everyone for joining me.
Thanks, Miriam.
Thank
Take care.
you.
So
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks. But for me too.